Man, these Fridays come by fast, Tim. It just seems like we just got off this podcast a little while ago, and here we are
I
again.
know, I know. Yeah. Today we're talking about something near and dear to my heart. When I was actually looking at today's topic, governance, I was thinking, you know, we don't talk about this very much, governance and compliance, but it's part and parcel of how organizations must track and validate what they're doing. And it's funny because as a project manager, we have to ensure that the authorizations are in place, the signatures in place, and we're following process and procedure, even though we're not doing those audits and tests. But how, and one of my students said, Tim, how can I actually track that?
Well,
And
it's
go
interesting
ahead.
you said that we don't talk about it very much, but and then we do talk about it, I think we narrow it too much to being just the responsibility of the project manager to make things are in place. So I think one of the things we can do today, and I'm sure you've got a story to start us off, but I think one of the things that we can do is kind of expand what we understand, or what you and I certainly understand about what really means, is really meant by project governance.
Well, let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Okay, so we know governance is like sign-offs, authorizations, and approvals. And compliance, we always think about compliance as quality audits, QA, right? Are we following process and procedure? My aha moment with governance was when I was working with a 175-year-old corporation. It had 7 CIOs. It had over 100,000 employees. And one of the CIOs had asked me to help them figure out, as a corporation, consolidate data centers, right? And he said, okay, what's the business case look like? Luckily, I'm a trained financial analyst too, so I was able to do that. And I had 72 tabs in a spreadsheet. I had all that, and I was looking at a return on investment, and here. And he said, boy, that's good too. I don't think my company could have developed something as nice and as knowledgeable as that. And then he took a breath. He said, okay, Tim, now on your plan, show me the tests that are going to test for that return on investment. And show me the user acceptance testing where we're going to come back and say, yes, we are getting that value. And how do you see us receiving that value at the end of the project? And I was gobsmacked. I was saying, we're giving you a deliverable. No, we were giving him value. And he was asking to create a metric such that he could say, yes, indeed, I'm getting that value. And from that time on, my understanding of what we're supposed to track and monitor as signatures and sign-offs was totally different.
How many project managers are in it for the deliverable and the deliverable sign off without really understanding what are the repercussions of putting that deliverable into practice on the project?
Exactly. And from a governance standpoint, are we measuring the right things? And yes, we are measuring the rules and tools right thing, but are we thinking too narrowly? Like you said, are we thinking too narrowly of these topics of governance and compliance?
And I was thinking about this too as you were talking. Um, each project I've ever been on has a change request process. And if I take a look at the change request process in terms of how the change request is authored, what goes into it in terms of the exploration and the investigation as to why this is a change request, who gets to bring it forward to the change request body, who gets to authorize it and sign it off, who gets to, if you think about that, just in that one little piece of a project, there's an entire governance structure around just that. And so if we can take just the change request process and blow it up to the extrapolate it for the full project, you can see how you have different levels of governance on the whole project.
Now, let's tack that to the wall. That's really important. Okay. Let's talk about your perception of governance, because you have multiple layers. You have experts and stakeholders. You, in your major projects, you're training. You put your stakeholders through formal training to help you gather requirements and perform the user acceptance testing. And then you have state government, federal government. So what does governance look like for you, and how do you get your hands around all of these approvals and sign-offs?
That's an excellent question. And I remember being on my very first large government project and thinking, I'll never get this. I will never understand this. Because, for me as a project manager, it made sense that I would establish the governance with my direct counterpart on the client side, such that there would be proper sign-offs, proper authorizations to continue the work. And in a model that I typically worked in, which was waterfall or predictive model, you didn't start phase 2 until you finished phase 1 and got authorization. You didn't start phase 3 until you got phase 2 authorized, right? So there was all of that governance, and typically you tried to think, that's between me and my counterpart and our teams supporting us. But little did I understand until I got knee deep into it. For example, in a state government project, most of their funding came from the federal government. So although the federal government didn't have direct authorization responsibility on what happened on the project, they definitely had a governance responsibility in terms of how their money was spent and whether the return on investment, as you had mentioned earlier, was in fact met. So yeah, that's just 2 examples, and I'll stop talking here because I can go on forever. So
yeah, and the mind boggles just from the technical mechanics of tracking and managing those. I can imagine, what the effort and the investment would be to set that up, much less do it.
Thinking about that too, just when we got the federal reporting done properly so that they could establish their governance where they were responsible, then the legislative bodies at the state level wanted to get involved because they had some legislative dollars into the project as well. So they needed to know. So there was a governance structure there through the reporting mechanism. Yeah. And any of those could have stopped or changed course of our project at any time.
This is where stakeholder engagement management is one of the most critical aspects. And this has to be transparent, and it has to be current, and it has to be authentic. You're creating a need to create a whole new knowledge area in project management and new documents like governance traceability matrix instead of requirements traceability.
Even a governance checklist.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, and here's another example. One of the projects, they had a huge union presence, which hadn't, I was working for a system integrator at that time. We had bid and won the project. No one had told us in any of the articles of the request for proposal or any of the stuff that we went forward with that there was a very strong union involved. And so suddenly they had a governance responsibility over ensuring that the system that we delivered was in compliance with union regulations and union rules, basically. So yeah, we ended up in that case attracting governance.
So there's 2 things that are running through my mind. One of them is just the effort of managing all this. The second is risk. What if I get this wrong? What if I don't identify these? You're talking about failure at any of these levels, but at the same time, you're not going to find all of these stakeholders. So what do you use as a threshold, or how do you, the mechanisms, how do you say to yourself, we need somebody to authorize this. We need either an escalation path, or we need somebody representing the interest or needs of this requirement or this group to sign off. Where do you actually find that?
So again, I'm coming at it from an external system integrator perspective. It may be slightly different if I was an internal IT shop, but a lot of times the governance or at least the authority for sign-offs, was established right in the request for proposal. So that when we bid the job, and should we be lucky enough to win it, once we won it and the contract was established, that governance was carried over from the request for proposal into the contract. So from that perspective, the authorizations were there in the contract. We then would transfer those into our project charter to make sure that the project charter had all of that in it as well. And the nice thing about the project charter is it's a living document. It's not shelfware. So in the example that I used, where we picked up the union as another governance partner, we could pull the project charter and add that right in the documentation for our project charter. So that way we could keep it living and active and making sure that we were truly being governed properly, or governing the project properly.
So I found a similar experience working internal projects as well as consulting projects, business to business. Basically, we'd start off with these initial contractual and project charter discussions, identifying the key stakeholders and the key purpose and all those, and finding the key individuals who are going to be authorizing here and here and here. Here's the person who signs off on the entire project. Here's the funding approval. Here's all the aspects. And then we get into our surveys, and then we get into our on-site interviews, which is at a further extension of planning when you're working with clients and other companies. And all of a sudden a guy comes to me and he says, "Oh, I didn't tell you this, but there's a whole other organization that we're working on it's gonna blow them out of the water, and they think that the work we're doing here with you is going to cut their staffing on half. I need to make you aware of this."
Well,
all of a sudden I'm thinking, number one, a stakeholder risk is now an issue, and number two, how are we going to get them in to actually get them embedded in the decision making?
but think of that, and that's important for our listeners. Some of our listeners are working for system integrator shops that go out and contract, and many of our listeners are working in internal shops. The logistics of how we obtain authorization may be different, but the importance for a governance process and an authorization process doesn't change whether you're an external developer or an internal IT shop. You still have to have that authorization.
Oh yeah, you need that. And again, as a project manager, we learn over time that the wisest position to be in is advisory. I, as a project manager, help you understand and give you advice so you can make the proper decision. Sponsor, so you can make the proper decision. Finance, so you can make the proper decision. HR, HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley, all these sign-offs. I'm an advisor. I help you make the best decision you can.
And that's when a project manager is truly becoming a project manager. It's not giving up on the nuts and bolts of what you do with the schedule and the team every day, but now you're thinking strategically, working with your client base and with their executive to make sure that everything is put in place and authorized correctly.
Very good.
By the way, you started that question, which we spent the last 5 minutes answering, which I thought was pretty good. But you started the question with the word risk. And I thought that's an interesting approach, because I approach governance, maybe it's my mindset, but I approach governance from the perspective of mitigating risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because and you're right. But I found that a lot of people approaching governance approach it as a sign-off, as a milestone, as just an achievement. And one of the things that the training material for project management from PMI talks about is risk. There's almost 5 slides on that, which it means this is pretty important to PMI. And I thought about that. And I have my opinion on this. I really think that having a governance risk discussion is important because signatures and sign-offs are major gates in our activities. And if we, number one, if we don't get them, they're going to stop. And hopefully we identify these authorization points as a risk. Number two, why aren't we considering what happens if we don't get that sign off? It's not just work stoppage, right? Sometimes it's corporate fines. And one of the greatest communication tools we can have is putting an item on a risk register that says, if we don't get this sign off at this point for this project, the company is at risk of paying $400,000 whenever they have a data breach or whenever they're exposing personal information. And then they're going to be publicly shamed. You know, that when we make the impact of not getting these authorizations just as visible as getting these things, then we can actually raise the understanding of what governance really means to a project. It's not just impact to the project, it's impact to, you know, the success of the business as a whole.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the other thing that we as project managers have to manage very carefully is to make sure that the process doesn't overweight the product. Because I think there's times that what you just talked about, a project manager can get so anal about that kind of stuff that they suddenly, all their time is spent on process. And they forget that over here they have to deliver.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that, we're always walking that fine line of balancing process and product and team management and all that.
So here's a question for you. What are the specific mechanisms you use to track and monitor your signatures and sign-offs and approvals?
Yeah, I guess my experience has been in every situation. For example, a lot of our fixed price projects are based on delivering deliverables, if I can use that. And so each one of those deliverables then becomes a pay point. So if I have a deliverable that's, say, 6 months from the previous one, I'm waiting for 6 months to get paid. But each one of those is tracked through its development, through its approval process internal, through its QA process external, through its review process with the formal reviewers, through its, you know, all of that. So each step we track. That can be as simple as as an Excel spreadsheet, or it can be as sophisticated as a project management system. But typically, if I use the word deliverable and then extrapolate that to other functions within the project, each one of those touch points is tracked, dated against when it's supposed to be completed. So I guess it all comes down to schedule and tracking.
See, that's the key. That's the key. I found out early in my career, putting authorizations as a milestone between activities was a great gating tool. Yeah. And you have the ability in a lot of software, and you can do this manually too, of creating categories of milestones. You can have governance milestones that say, yes, yes, yes. And all of a sudden you're treating your milestones as requirements. And I guess, you know, to a great point, we could identify milestones as a requirement. We must get this done by this point, right? That's a great approach. Now, this means that we can also use these as compliance checks too on our schedule. For instance, am I following process and procedure for my project, right? Did I check the mailroom on Thursday for the shipment that should be here by next Tuesday, right? Mitigating risk, but I'm using a milestone as a reminder of saying either I am or somebody is doing that check to make sure that the process is in line with the plan.
Well, and if you look at any of the project plans that I put together or the ones that I've worked with, using the deliverable as an example, I can go right into the project schedule and said, and this is the whole compliance thing, that say by February 15th, I need to have my requirements definition delivered. by February 25th, I need to have the review process completed and the review responses back to the organization that wrote the deliverable in the first place. Then they have 5 more days to clean that up. So it's right in the schedule, and that becomes not only the tracking mechanism, but as you're saying, it becomes the compliance mechanism, because the compliance is built right into the schedule.
Again, we talk about the humanistic approach to project management. We can't forget these fundamental tools and why initially as project managers we find them so valuable.
That example I gave you where I learned as a young project manager that I also had the federal government as one of my governance partners. The last project I was on, I think the deliverables section alone was about 16 pages of tracking to make sure that the feds knew that we were on track as well. So yeah, it becomes burdensome, but it becomes good burden, because me as the project manager doing that work for my governance partners meant that I'm also on top of what I need to be doing.
Well, and that's the key. We talk about this in quality too. How much quality do I have to make formal on my project? The answer, of course, is just enough, right? So that the investment in the quality actually creates an equal benefit. And it's the same thing with conformance. Yeah. But at the same point, the voice of the customer, what your stakeholders are saying, what business and finance, what your attorneys are saying will actually assist you in how formal and how much time and effort you're investing is ensuring these things are happening.
So in these projects, kind of piggybacking on what you just asked, what hints do you get along the way that tells you we need someone at this point to authorize this? I mean, the obvious one that I used was deliverables. You have to have the client sign off so you can continue. That's obvious. But what are some other ones that you may think of?
So whenever I have a requirement, I think to myself, how am I at the end going to have a checklist that says, see, this requirement was met. Mm-hmm. See, this requirement was met. And then I look at those requirements and I say, when on the schedule do I get a checklist? Do I say that? And is it appropriate for me, the project manager, to check that off? Do I need to get somebody there? And we're not just talking about, the formal governance that we've been talking about earlier. We're talking about, I need somebody to watch my back and somebody to validate with. But sometimes I am not the expert and I do need to escalate. So I look at my requirements and look at the checklist. A lot of going against the user acceptance testing. And like you said, the schedule itself, the phase gates, those gating places in our project where some work ends and other work must wait for that work to end to start. That's a lot of what I use.
Yeah, very similar. I've gone even as far as, say, down to the developer level, the programmer level, where we request them or require them to peer review each other's code. And so much is put in place where we've got a lot more time, is to have their team leads make sure that code does not get put into the next level of testing until it's been peer reviewed. So there's even a small bit of governance at that level in terms of an authorization and what goes forward at that point.
Extreme programming in the Agile universe talks about this, talks about the workers, basically, quote unquote, 2-in-a-box work. And part of that is bouncing ideas off of each other. But the other part is, level checking and process checking and sanity checking to that work. Now, here's what I concern myself with all the time. We do that with our project teams. We sometimes even do that with our stakeholders. I've had stakeholders say, okay, guys, I'm going to need both you guys to sign off on this. But as a project manager, the nature and culture of project management, and this is what I worry about, is such that I feel that I work in isolation. That's one of the values, and that's one of the deficits of being in a management position, and the culture saying, you're the lone gun, the buck stops there.
It does, but at the same time, I always know that once I've in isolation thought through the process, that I have my governance partner to help me understand if it's authorizable, if I can use that term at that point. So
Yep.
you're right, you are a Lone Ranger, but you always have someone who's got your back.
Oh, yes, yes. I have speed dial 3 to 5 people at any time saying, am I crazy for thinking this, or is there a better way for me to approach this? And I have my PMO guys, I have my finance guys.
Yes.
Of course, I have my business guys, my finance and contract people, but I also have my leadership people. Are you thinking about your stakeholders? Are you thinking about your executives and what they need?
And you've got your own executives behind you because their bonus depends on how well you do. So
Oh boy, as as long as you're going to your executives and ensuring and communicating that your project is aligned with their objectives. See, this is where managing up and leading up is just as important as leading amongst your peers and leading your direct reports.
yeah. You said something interesting a little while ago too, because in terms of we at our level don't always know, what's ready, what's signable. So you're kind of, I guess I took that to mean you sort of push some of that authorization down to that level that can make the decision. And I was thinking about this. You know how often we're in corporations and you're working with an administrative person or a salesperson, and you get to a point and they go, "Oh no, I can't make that decision. I have to go." I have to go talk to someone else, and they actually put delays in the process. My wife and I were flying out of our hometown a while ago. There was some issues where they couldn't fly, and we had to make a connection to get us over to our vacation spot. And so I talked to not somebody in headquarters, but I talked to the gate agent in terms of being able to get our bags up out of the hold of the plane, get our tickets canceled so I could run over to another carrier, get a ticket on that carrier, and meet our vacation destination flight. And here's what's interesting. Not only did they do that, they hustled and got other people to help in such a way that our bags were delivered to the other airline properly. Everything was they refunded our tickets without any penalties because they knew that we had to get to our destination spot. To me, that is authorization down to a level that can make that decision because they know what's going on. And as a result of that, they had a very happy customer. I've flown them hundreds of times since then. Well, tens of times. But you see what I'm saying is when we get that authorization right, not only do we make good decisions, but we keep our customers and our client base happy.
Yeah, we actually get those approvals in the urgency that they can be effective.
I was going to say, can you imagine explaining my situation to somebody in some nameless headquarters halfway around the world? No, these people witnessed what I was going through, my wife and I were going through, and was able to handle it right there. So I guess that's the point you were making before, and I just try to put a practical example in place.
Oh, that's brilliant. And to actually emphasize your story, I've worked inside a very mature corporations, 100, 150, 175 years old, and they've actually made a lot of mistakes, and some of them is the churn of making decisions and taking too long. And a lot of these corporations have decided, let's put a dollar limit to everybody's rank in the company. And let's say that a director is going to make $100,000 decisions, and a VP is going to make $500,000 decisions, and a chief executive, whichever one they are, chief officer is going to make $1 million decision. If you have a $10 million decision, go to the board of directors. When I've seen that, number one, they create trust. So people become responsible and accountable for the decision they make. And number two, for somebody like me as a project manager, I can say, okay, I have a $5,000 decision. Who among my stakeholders have that authority? Can I talk to them? Can I talk to them? If they are not comfortable, can I have them help me find the right $5,000 decision maker to make this decision? It makes it fast and efficient and very transparent.
Well, and there's nothing quite as frustrating as what I've seen in my career, where you entrust a project manager with $100 million project, but he can't make a $200 airline decision for one of his.
I hear that so many times. One of my friends was making billion-dollar factories, and he was asking to have 2 computers added to the training room on the second floor, and he couldn't get that through because he didn't have that authority. He had his own team of 75 reports, staff, right? And he had that signature authority for his organization. He had that in spades, but inside of his project, it was incredibly limited, and that is frustrating.
Yeah.
And it's lopsided.
So I want to explore a little bit more, Tim, about this. What you start bringing up with this risk, is there a role of risk in governance, and how it helps us improve our treatment of the way we collect authorizations and signatures? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah. Let's start with what we said earlier. One of my opinions is that you need to address the chance of not getting that signature against that chance of getting the signature. They're probabilities, they're not real yet. Now, that means you're going to be identifying risk. It's an automatic one of the topics that I'm going to have to question, and I'm going to have to push and prod all of my authorizations and see if there's something I need to address before it happens. Number 2, I'm going to have that as a transparent discussion that with my team and my stakeholders, we all agree that there is a result if we don't get that signature, as well as if we do. If we don't check that mailroom, it's going to slow down the project. If we don't get that sign off, we're exposing the company to $400,000 fine. We need to have those type of conversations. This is, and again, I can be shouldered with all the decisions, but that's not an effective project. An effective project is the people who get the rewards are exposed to the risk and understand the risk with those rewards. The authorizations we all see as rewards, yay, we did it, we got what we want. But at the same time, we really need to understand the impact of if we don't.
Exactly. And I'm going to give you a real life situation that just happened in my current project experience. And that was, we're into 3-week sprints now. And at the end of each sprint, we do a product demonstration. And we got to the day of the product demonstration, and they could only demonstrate 2/3 of the stories, roughly, because the product owner had not signed off on the other 1/3. So what's the ramifications of them not signing off? We ended up pushing 1/3 of they were by and large complete, but we ended up pushing them off into the next sprint. At the same time, what if they would have signed off on something that wasn't quite right? Now you've got a process that, well, obviously it's not quite right, but also you've got change orders and change requests that could be happening. So, you're always balancing that. And kudos to that product owner who said, I can't sign off on this. I'm going to take a chance that we could delay the project a couple of days, but we have to push this off. I can't sign off on this. So I thought that was, from that perspective, that person looked at the risk, weighed the risk, and made the decision, and made the correct decision in my estimation.
You have to support a person like that because they're stating what they see as the truth.
Yeah.
And you have to agree, we need more bravery like that into actually creating successful projects. Let me give you an example. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Hold on to that. I just want to finish this too. The other thing that I thought of was that product owner did not go to her boss She did not go to the project director. She was authorized to make that decision by herself with the support of her team. To me, that is a high functioning escalation process, governance process, whatever it is that we're going. Sorry, I cut you off. You have an example.
Oh no. That's good. That's a good point you made. So I have a current project. And this one is really, talking about authorizations and profound risk here. We have a gating decision, and the stakeholder who agreed to be making the decision has gone dark. And the organization, and the organization has said they're the only person, this person is the only person authorized because they understand this. And so it's like we're looking at work stoppage, and this struck us sideways, and it was funny in a macabre way that we couldn't have even identified this. And it actually reminds me of my consulting days when I said, okay, that's one for my lessons learned, and I have a new item on my governance checklist to confirm, commitment and obligation. And it's funny, as we project managers are known for, being adamant, and this is why, because we get in these situations and there are uncontrollable circumstances that put our projects at great risk when the only person who's able to authorize, not just allowed to, but able to authorize is there. It does, it blows the schedule up, but it also blows the potential for a good project.
So if I were listening to Merv and Tim right now as a young project manager, I'd say, I see the problem, but what could we have done in terms of lessons learned to avoid the problem?
Right. I hinted at it early in the class. I hate to say this. Well, I don't hate to say this. It adds extra burden to our work as project managers, but we have scope, schedule, budget. We have quality, risk, contracts. We have communication. We have all these things. I am not recommending. I actually heartily support the fact that we create another knowledge area. It may not be in the PMBOK, but it's going to be in our lessons learned that said, here's a whole area of compliance. It needs to be discussed in the project charter. It needs to be integrated in the plan. We need configuration management. We need tests and inspections to make sure it happens. Formal change has to integrate these approvals in with the rest of the project. This is how important I really think this topic is.
And, as often as I've taken, we do lessons learned in every project. And I've also acquired lessons learned from reading. But this is the first time I am acquiring a lesson learned from our podcast. I'm going to take your example back, and I'm going to do my lessons learned checklist, because I think in a situation like yours, we need to put right up front in the project contract, perhaps, if not the charter, that everyone has to have a backup person.
Yeah, there has, and this is why I'm so adamant about that discussion on risk. See, we talk about this in our teams, we're going to get this sign off. We never talk about the threat of what if. We're not just talking about single point of contact. Like I said, we're not just talking about project success or failure here. When we get into governance and compliance, all of a sudden we're talking about, we're talking about federal and state and local and financial and Security and Exchange Commission and all these other governance and compliance activities that are part of our contract. And we need to raise it to a discussion topic when these things impact our work.
Well, and one other thing, I remember as a young person learning the ropes, in situations something like this, I'd go to my manager and say, well, that's not our problem, that's the client's problem. They caused the issue. And my manager would go and say, well, it's their problem. Absolutely. But if this contract is canceled, we've got 40 people who don't have jobs tomorrow that we have to find work for. So I suggest that we make it our problem as well.
Yes, they were very gentle in conveying that message to you. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So
So
it's no longer us and them, it's we. We are
right.
together on this project. Yeah.
Exactly. So, do you have any more final words on this? I think we have done a very good job
I do.
in stating what we think is important about governance and compliance. Is there anything else that we could talk?
How about escalations? We didn't really touch on escalations. I mean, we did some glancing blows as we discussed, but I think, I think we have to understand when to escalate, how to escalate, why to escalate, and some of that comes with experience. I've been on projects where everything gets escalated, and so therefore nothing gets escalated, right?
Yes.
If everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority.
So how about this?
Yeah.
Oftentimes we cannot analyze everything down to a dollar amount and assign, a dollar level decision authority. But there has to be some type of business knowledge. How does the organization make similar decisions? And if it's a financial decision, maybe finance or the client's finance will give us a hint as how that organization escalates. And I think to a great extent, especially when you're consulting, you're not reinventing the wheel. You want to do something that people already have habits around and they understand. What about you?
Well, and that goes back exactly what you just said, goes back to lessons learned. I may have learned something on a project 6 years ago that I'm suddenly seeing rear its head on this project. Why wouldn't I carry forward that lessons learned and use that as a historical precedent for what my escalation is going to look like at this point? That's
very good.
And some of that is, I think some of it comes with maturity, some of it comes with experience, some of it comes with having failed in areas on projects and learning from that. And I think some of it also, there's some legal precedents, there's some positional precedents. In other words, at certain levels, you can't make those calls.
Right.
So it all comes down to me, it comes down to a lot of what's in your project charter and what's in your bag of experience tricks.
Yeah, and again, taking the position of the project manager as an advisory role. Yeah. I advise you to do this, but you have the decision, making sure that the proper people understand that this is their role. And if they want the results of the project, they're going to have to step up and fill that role. I wouldn't tell somebody that directly, but at the same point, that whole attitude, that mindset must be somehow communicated.
Yeah. Keeping people in the know, understanding where your authority lies, what level. And it's fine to say that's above my pay grade, as long as you're not using it to shirk responsibility.
Yeah.
But there are things that truly are above your pay grade.
Right. It's making that statement with or without complacency. Right. It's basically saying, I don't care, or I'm concerned about this too, and yeah, you're speaking truth there.
But and it's amazing, Tim, how often I've been able to get my message across in situations where I did not have the authority by bumping into people who do in the coffee shop.
Yes. It's always good to have, those leading stakeholders who you can just say, this is, I know this is your objective, and this is going on. This is interesting. Did you know this? Not in a malicious manner, right, but basically exposing things that they need to know.
Oh, absolutely. That's our duty. That's our requirement. That's our advisory capacity as project managers.
Correct.
So if you were a young project manager listening to us, or even someone just going into project management, whether you're young or not, how would you summarize how they would get started in the governance realm based on our discussion today?
Add to the requirements gathering, authorizations and approvals as a category, and go out and check those things. Also, number 2, risk. In your risk identification checklist, add governance, approvals and authorizations and compliance, right? And then number 3, build in your configuration management throughout that. So you're going back to those requirements, you're validating or ensuring those risks are more or less probable of occurring, and you're keeping an eye on them. Whether it's a milestone or it's just as a risk register item, or it's a requirement that you're actively pursuing, these are the things that we already have in place that we can actually place governance in these tools.
I agree. And to me, also visibility, keeping things visible, not just to your team, but to your clients, to all the stakeholders. And part of what we discussed before, putting those actual tasks on the schedule and use the word sign off right on the schedule. I think those sorts of visibility points help all of us, help keep us all on track in terms of meeting that schedule and meeting our requirements and responsibilities.
You've actually inspired me to. This gives me an idea for updating my dashboards. What if I have issues, risks, and opportunities, but I also have governance and compliance gates upcoming? And that's, boy, that, communication transparency, I think, does create that sense of urgency that approvals and authorizations require.
And I think, Tim, we should put a stamp of our own ideas here. So if someone from PMI is listening, the idea that Tim had of a governance knowledge base is Tim's idea. It's not PMI's.
If there are other project managers out there who have the same conviction, please take that idea and run with it. Write white papers, talk about it on YouTube. And if you are a member of PMI, start connecting with the people, and if you're serious, because this is something that I've observed from 4th to 5th to 6th, now into the 7th edition of the PMBOK, and now the process group and the agile practice guides are all talking about governance. So we know it's important to PMI, and it's gaining a lot of importance there. So who knows where this could actually take you as well.
In fact, as we normally close, you can find Tim and myself on LinkedIn. Why don't you share your thoughts and even your white papers with us on LinkedIn?
That would be a joy.
That would be fun. We could collaborate and come up with a whole new inclusion for the next PMBOK or the next round of PMI updates.
Very good. Well, it's always a joy. Thank you very much. And I can't wait to see what we're going to be talking about next week.
Exactly. All right. Until then, we'll take it easy.